¿Qué tal? Buenas noches, bienvenidos a Espiral. ¿Sabe usted que tiene derecho a algo así como a vivienda adecuada? Hoy vamos a hablar de qué quiere decir ese derecho y vamos a hablar de cómo exigirlo y vamos a hablar de cómo se está construyendo esta discusión de manera comparada a nivel internacional, porque está con nosotros hoy Leilana Fara, ella es relatora de la ONU justamente para el derecho a la vivienda adecuada. Y también invitamos a Enrique Ortiz. Enrique Ortiz es un especialista, estuvo al origen en la Constitución de la Ciudad de México, justamente abordando el problema de suelos, de agua, de transporte, de vivienda, que nos ofrece o no dignidad a la hora de refugiarnos en un espacio propio para la familia, para la comunidad a la que pertenecemos. La discusión sobre el hábitat, sobre ese entorno que nos da dignidad a la hora de vivir o nos la quita, es el tema de hoy y lo llamamos así, vivienda adecuada. Comenzamos. Esta noche, lo anuncié, estoy con Leilana Fara. Ella es relatora de Naciones Unidas para un derecho que se llama vivienda adecuada. Leilana, thank you very much for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To Spiral. The very first question I have for you is if there is such a thing as a human right called adequate housing. What is that? I mean, it's quite new for me and I think for the audience too. Could you define what is that?
There is definitely a thing called the right to adequate housing. In fact, in the Constitution of Mexico, you have the right to adequate housing in your constitution. But it also exists in international human rights treaties, which Mexico and many other countries have signed and ratified and agreed to, made commitments to. But what does it mean,
Exactly.
of course? And what does it mean in reality versus on paper?
If I rent a house, I am exercising my right to adequate housing. If I buy one, if I have credit or I don't have, if I have mortgage, if I don't have, how does that deal with this right?
Well, it is about access to housing.
Okay.
So that's what you described. If you can rent or own, then you have access to housing, and that is part of the right. We say that it's a very broad right. So it's not just about having a roof. It's about living in dignity, in peace, and with security. And security meaning that you can't just be kicked out of your home or off your lands, you know? So it has that meaning. It has also very particular meaning. You should have access to basic services, running water that's, clean, sanitation, access to electricity, access to schools close by, decent employment nearby, health facilities, transportation, very important, especially right now. So it has a very rich meaning, but the concept of dignity is very central to the right to housing, and you can tell if someone is living in dignity or not, and then you know whether their right is being realized.
Social rights, education, health, start on the 19th century. And it was clear by that time that the state has the obligation to bring these rights. Okay. What happened with adequate housing? Is the state who has the obligation, is compelled to bring this right to people?
The state has the obligation to implement the right to adequate housing and all levels of government. So when we say the state, we mean all levels of government. But what we're seeing, and for some time now, is the state receding from their obligation and handing over the obligation, whether they say that's what they're doing or not, but handing over that obligation to the private sector. And that has huge
or to the social sector.
What do you mean by social sector?
I mean, mostly it's private sector?
Yes. Okay. Mostly the private sector. In some instances, and here in Mexico I'm seeing it, the people are also implementing their own right to housing, but not as much, I think, as they could or would like to. But you see the role of globally, in my role as rapporteur, I'm looking at the world and I'm seeing everywhere the private sector heavily involved. And not just the private sector involved in housing, but also international financial investment firms, private equity firms, numbered corporations, very involved in housing and real estate.
I love this piece of theater from Sophocles, Antigone, where the main idea is that the person who lives inside a city is a citizen. The person that lives outside the city is not a citizen, it's a barbarian person. Now, in the 21st century, Antigone is very common to see, very actual, because policies, policies from cities are strongly discriminative. What you see is that sending poor people outside the cities, putting transport that is not adequate, putting housing that is not that has not dignity. What is going on with this right to adequate housing, and on the other hand, policies that are not going on the same way?
Yeah. I think to begin, I don't want to just blame city policies and city programs.
Okay.
Because I think it's also at the national level, central governments are playing a role in this as well. But when I look globally, and this has been a big area of research for me as rapporteur, when I'm looking globally, what I see is, as you described, and I have a short way of describing it, housing is now seen as a commodity, a very good place to invest massive amount of capital, to park your capital there, and housing is not seen as a social good or a human right. And that has huge repercussions for what policies and programming is developed in a country or at the city level. And I think you're quite right. There's a tremendous pressure on cities. Everyone is moving, a lot of people are moving to cities. Cities are growing at a really very fast rate. But is there available housing at affordable cost for those people that are moving to cities? No. Are there jobs that enable people to afford the existing housing? No. So people are the influx of people puts pressure on cities, but there hasn't been a responsiveness by governments to ensure that the people who are coming to the cities can actually live in decent housing.
That would mean that planification is the main problem. Would you put planification as the main priority?
Urban planning, you mean?
Urban planning?
Yeah. It should be a priority, but I actually think human rights should be the priority. And so urban planning should be responsive to human rights. If people have the right to adequate housing, we have to ask, well, what does that mean in terms of urban planning? What does it mean in terms of fiscal policies within a country? You know, if you look at speculation, land speculation, it is completely unregulated, basically. We're starting to see some cities taking control of this. You know, if you look at Singapore, they have a long history of control, trying to curb speculation and to make sure that there's adequate housing for people who are going to be living in that city. Starting to see other cities doing things, but generally that sector is unregulated, and certainly unregulated from a human rights perspective.
If you go to London, if you go to Paris, if you go to Mexico City, pension funds, for example, are investing in the main buildings in the downtowns in the city, and now that makes very expensive land there, and this is one of the mechanisms of expulsion, of discrimination. How to curb, as you said, this kind of phenomena that we are looking all over the world?
Yes, that is the question, at least for my mandate right now. That is the question that I'm asking. What can be done? I have looked at what different cities are doing. Some cities have interesting policies. You know, every new building that goes up, 30% of the units, for example, this is in London, 25% of the units should be affordable. And then we get into debates about what is affordable. But at least it's a policy that understands we can't just allow these buildings to go up with luxury units, that we need to ensure that the people who work in cities, who make cities work, who bring life to cities, the people who are nurses, firefighters, working in the services, serving us our coffee, they need to live in the city as well. So there's that kind of policy. Some cities and states are imposing higher taxes on foreign speculation or foreign investors. So they increase the tax rate. Some are using capital gains tax. There are a variety of methods. Will any of that work? Is it enough? I'm not certain. I actually think we need to start changing our conversation, because none of those things really change the model that we're working from. None of them question, should that piece of land be worth, is it really worth however many millions of dollars? I was in New York a few months ago, and I was looking at this really tall, uber modern building, very groovy, architecturally designed. And I was like, what's this building? So I Googled to find out. It was on Leonard Street. It's called the Leonard Street Building. So then I looked up, how much did the penthouse sell for? The penthouse, $95 million US dollars. Is anyone questioning whether it's actually true and possible that this piece of square footage in the air could really be worth 95 million?
Does the state or the government should put the price of this apartment?
I think the state or the government has to ask, what does that...
And after asking?
Well, they have to ask, what does that mean in terms of the right to adequate housing for the lowest income person who's living on the sidewalk?
And what
Is there a relationship?
What is the relationship?
Yeah.
What happened when this penthouse costs this? What is the consequences for the people living in
It is escalating the price of all housing. That's part of the problem.
Okay.
Part of the problem. The other part, which you mentioned before, is the moving in pension funds buying up residential real estate, private equity firms buying up residential real estate, and then renting it out at higher costs. Again, escalating the costs, and it's destroying communities. You're having vacant homes. It's a problem in many of the cities that you mentioned.
All the lights turn off.
Exactly.
You see the cities with all the lights turned off because it's just an investment. It's no longer a house.
Yeah.
Last week or 2 weeks ago, Barcelona forbid Airbnb because Airbnb is doing more or less that, increasing the price of rent and ownership.
And reducing the stock,
Exactly.
because Airbnb anyone knows, if I rent an apartment on a long-term basis, I make X amount of money. If I rent on a short-term basis...
4 weekends, and it's a lot of money. And it's more or less the same kind of pressure that the pension funds or the other funds are doing. What is your opinion about it? Not the Airbnb, but the phenomenon.
I have a mixed opinion, because I think
because you have rented in Airbnb your own apartment. Okay, it's my case.
I make no confessions on your show.
Okay. I will do it.
I have a mixed opinion, because I think the way these short-term rentals started with Airbnb was as a means for someone to make a little extra income.
Monetize the owner of the property.
That's right. In an economy that is very difficult for people to survive, So you have an extra room in your apartment or in your condo, and you think, I can help pay my electricity bill, my food bill, my heating, whatever, if I rent this out on a short-term basis, this extra room. Well, I don't have a problem with that, really. People are struggling to make ends meet. But what I don't like is when I go to Portugal or, in Lisbon or London.
There are hotel enterprises doing exactly the same.
Yes, and it's multinationals going in. I saw in Porto, in Portugal, multinational companies coming in, buying old buildings, beautiful old buildings, converting them to short-term rentals, and then there's nowhere for the people to live.
And you regulate that? Is there any policy? This policy from Barcelona is a good idea?
Yes, I do think regulation is a good idea. I don't, as I said, I kind of like the model, the small scale model. So I don't know if you want to touch that with the regulation. But I think what Barcelona is doing is very interesting. I think the city of Toronto is doing similar things, trying to play with the model a little bit.
Where we are living in a capitalist world and property rights are important. And many houses in this world, many houses in Mexico, many houses in Mexico City have a lot of problems about property rights because houses were built under illegal land. I know that you have been seeing this phenomenon in Latin America. What is your opinion? How to resolve this lack of property rights and housing?
I did visit an area today here in Mexico. Sorry?
Ciudad de Nezahualcóyotl.
Yes, yes. And it's definitely a problem, but property rights do not trump human rights. So the state has a role to play, I think. So when you have a property owner and a person who is in need of the right to adequate housing, who's being denied the right to adequate housing, there's a tension and a conflict.
Oh, always.
And I understand that tension and conflict, but the
But
state...
when there is no property right, this is a violation of human right. If you don't have, it's your house,
Yes.
but it's not yours because there is no paper
Yes.
to confirm that.
Yes.
You have there a problem of human right.
Yes, yeah, a big problem. And you have people who believe they have purchased the land and build their home, and then they're told that their home is illegal, they shouldn't be living there, they're not given basic services. The state has a role to play in ensuring that people have the right to adequate housing. So they have a role to play in any conflict that arises between a property owner and people who are living on land, whether, you know, in some countries they say, oh, they're living on this private land, it's illegal, etc. The state has to do something. What's the alternative? To leave the people homeless? To me, that's not a human rights alternative. We can't leave people homeless. Everyone needs a place to live that's decent, you know? So that's where we're seeing states really pulling back. You know, they don't want to get involved in private property, and they say, oh, we can't control private property or private ownership. I don't agree. I think states have a
The
really
state
important
have to
role.
rule over that.
Sorry?
The states have to regulate.
Yes, yes, or get involved. And I mean, there's different scenarios, so it depends on the scenario. When I was in Chile, for example, people were living on private lands, and the private owner was absent, and then the private owner comes back and then wants to evict the people. They say, well, I have property rights, you're living on my land, I want to evict you. Okay, but those people need an alternative. They need a decent place to live. And under international human rights law, that is the obligation, to provide them with somewhere to live. And we have criteria of what that should look like.
Leilana, I need a break and we come back. Vamos a corte y regresamos para seguir hablando del derecho a una vivienda adecuada. No se vaya. Estamos de vuelta hablando sobre el derecho a una vivienda adecuada con Leilana Fara. Ella es la relatora de Naciones Unidas justamente para el tema. Leilani, usually these kind of problems are related to risk zones, cliffs, mountains, lakes, earthquakes, risk, etc.
Yes.
The lack of planning has to do with that. What else? How to face, how to resolve this kind of risk that you see all over the world, but in Mexico, in Latin America, is very common. Favelas, etc.
Yeah. I mean, people don't want to live in dangerous areas. They live there out of necessity. I mean, that we have to be clear about, you know? No one wants to put their children and their family at risk and live on the side of a cliff or
This is
close
the only
to floods.
place affordable.
It's the only place affordable, the only place available, et cetera. So that's one thing. So then we have to say, okay, well, why are they being forced to live there? Obviously, the right to housing is not being implemented in a fulsome way if people don't have safe options for housing. So that's one. Two, one of the things I've noticed is sometimes what is deemed unsafe by governments is strategic and is the people themselves can figure out ways to make that area quite safe. But the government, for whatever reason, doesn't want the people to live on those lands. So that's another thing we have to question. Is it truly unsafe? And who says? Because a community can get an engineer coming in and saying, it's a little unsafe, but if we did this, that, and the other, it's safe. And the government can bring an engineer in and say, it's completely unsafe. So we have to be clear that there's some, sometimes discrepancies there.
Okay, who has to deal with this discrepancy?
Well, I
Usually it's
think
government.
the government, I think the government can look at the engineer supporting where the people are living and say, oh, maybe this is viable. Is this a viable place for these people to live? And the engineer is saying, is the engineer credible? Yes, then maybe we should. You know, I've seen it where communities have been living safely for years and years and years and years, and then one natural disaster happens, and the community, you know, is affected by the disaster, and then suddenly it's like, oh, the whole zone is dangerous.
You have to get out.
You have to question whether, okay, that being said, if the area really is a danger, a hazard, then there do have to be human rights policies and plans in place to relocate the community. It should be as close to where they are currently living as possible. They have to be relocated into adequate, decent housing with running water, electricity, et cetera, all those things I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. I don't see that very often, you know, really good relocation plans that are human rights based.
Looking inside this human right, adequate housing, there is another aspect of it as security. I mean, if you're talking about dignity, dignity means that you can go out and visit the street and travel without facing dangers. And what we are seeing now is parts of the city, of the cities, like old medieval cities with walls, enormous walls, and the rest of the population living in insecurity, facing gangs and facing serious problems, now drug trafficking, etc. And that is as well the result of policy, of diversified policies or unequal policies. What is your thought about it?
Well, I mean, we view security, there's a range of how we define security. There is this issue of violence and physical insecurity that is a problem. Obviously, if you segregate and discriminate against a certain population, a low-income population, and you force them into an area that's really uninhabitable, and there's overcrowding, and then sometimes alcohol and drugs, and it
You
can
only
lead
have police in certain areas and
Yeah, that's
don't in
right.
the other,
Yeah,
or
that's right.
lights, or
Yes. So, I mean, those are preventable conditions. And I've seen areas, in fact, when I was in Portugal, I saw areas that had been really full of gangs and drugs and prostitution and violence, and I have seen a committed government turning that around. Of course, the scary thing is sometimes you turn it around and it leads to gentrification and then all those other problems we just talked about financialization of housing, commodification. But it's a real, you know, if you create conditions where people are living in depravity, then you can expect certain things to flow from that. And so it is up to governments to try to create barrios, neighborhoods that are healthy and secure in a different way, where people have what we call security of tenure. You know, where they're not threatened with eviction from their homes, where they can live for a long time, where the homes will remain affordable, et cetera. So that's another kind of security that the right to adequate housing demands.
there are cities that have been involved in adequate transportation. It's related as well to adequate housing. And other cities that, again, there's transport for the rich, for the people from the penthouse, and transport for the rest, for the others. and as well, transport as a commodity, as just a business. What the UN has to say about it?
One of the things that I've noticed, and it's a global phenomenon, and I know that it's an issue here in Mexico, I've seen it in Chile, I've seen it in many places, is the idea that, okay, our cities are getting too big and there's all these informal settlements, maybe we can move people, relocate them to a different place, to better housing, whatever. And often
we forget the transport.
we forget the transport, among other things, but yeah, so we forget the culture. We forget a lot of things in those peri-urban settings, but we really forget about the transportation, because those people really will come back to the city because that's where all the jobs are. And so it's absolutely required, and schools and healthcare facilities and et cetera. So decent and affordable transportation is also required in terms of relocation, or in terms of if you expect a big part of your population to live in a peri-urban area, they need transport. I mean, that's just logical.
The very last question, and you already talk about it a little bit, this relationship between national governments and cities. Because now, like in the medieval ages, I mean, we are the more and more living inside cities. But city governments are not strong enough to deal with what you're talking about. On the other hand, national governments, at state level, they're not interested in that. This is not their issue. I mean, how talking about governance, how to resolve this idea of people living, 70% of the world is living now in cities. No? People living in cities, and national governments trying to play the Pilatus role.
You're taking me to every major issue that I have to deal with in 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, crazy. So when I first became rapporteur, the very first substantive report that I wrote was on the human rights responsibilities in the area of housing of local government and city governments. And so I really examined this relationship that you very aptly described, where the cities, everything is put on cities. In terms of housing, even in the most centralized states, cities are still responsible for housing. And I see very much often the national government kind of, cleaning its hands of dealing with housing. And yet cities don't often have the capacity and the resources to deal with all that they are dealing with as cities. So it is, you've highlighted a real problem. One of the things I say in my report is, if you're going to download human rights responsibilities with respect to housing to cities, then you have to make sure that they have the capacity and the resources. And that might mean changing the way in which a city can collect taxes, which taxes the city can collect. It may mean different transfer payments, better, more fulsome transfer payments between national level government and cities. It may mean that cities should be enabled to solicit funds from international donors. And there's a variety of mechanisms, but you have to empower cities, and often that's through legislation, to be able to do that. But also there has to be better coordination between national level government and cities. Sometimes I go to a place and they're not talking to each other at all. They might point the finger, but they're actually not engaged in a conversation about these are some of the most major issues of our time. I think housing in cities is it's maybe the #1 issue confronting cities. I would think national government and cities should be in deep dialogue about this. Even at the international level, I'll point the finger at the UN. We don't engage cities in our discussions and dialogues. I put myself aside because I always
United Nations, not United Cities. You need to change the name.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But no, the United Nations, the human rights system, we talk to national level government. We don't talk to cities, and yet it's cities that are so much of the socioeconomic rights cities are responsible for.
We have been talking about policies, government, legislation, you just mentioned. But justice, courts, where is, this human right can put before the court, before justice, or just this can as well, just to clean their hands?
No, access to justice is absolutely fundamental if someone is going to be able to enjoy their right to adequate housing. You know, we have this expression.
I don't know, people going to the judge and asking for adequate housing. I mean, there is no such a thing. I mean, maybe in case of education, I saw something in Mexico, but I don't recall nothing in Mexico. People say, I don't have adequate housing.
Yeah.
Mr. Judge, I want you to resolve this problem. Do you know any case that
Yeah,
can be an example for us?
Yeah, there
here
are
as well?
cases. South Africa always presents itself as the best
Okay.
access to justice
Africa,
system, where people have made claims about living in, being evicted off of lands and then living in terrible conditions and needing at least immediate shelter and then longer term housing options. So there are cases, and there are cases from Latin America as well. And even at the city level, there's interesting things going on around access to justice in Buenos Aires, in parts of Brazil. So it is there. It's not enough. I mean,
What kind of themes? I mean, rent, price of the housing, eviction. What kind of
yes,
subjects?
lots on evictions.
Okay.
That seems to be.
The same. The main.
And there's a reason for that, because in a way it's like easier to claim what someone shouldn't do. So
Yeah.
you shouldn't evict. It's like a negative thing, a negative right, we call it, as opposed to this is what a government or governments should do. And they should be, moving progressively and spending maximum resources on housing. Those are harder claims. So we see more eviction claims, but there are some more positive claims as well. But yes, on a variety of issues, even we see simple landlord and tenant issues coming up, not always from a human rights perspective, but that might fall within, we might say, it's human rights friendly.
And the international human rights system is dealing with these kind of cases?
Beginning to.
Okay.
So there's different ways. So in the international system, if a state has ratified a treaty, they have to go to a committee and show the committee that they are meeting their human rights obligations. So Mexico has ratified what we call the Treaty on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights.
So this is the reason, because you, as reported, can come here and make a report.
It's separate from my role.
Okay.
So there's a committee that sits in Geneva, and they will review Mexico's performance. It's supposed to be every 5 years. I think, in fact, Mexico will be reviewed soon, and it's been 12 years since they were reviewed. So this committee, it's independent experts in Geneva from all different countries and regions of the world, will examine, is Mexico meeting its socioeconomic human rights obligations? This is it's not as firm as another procedure, which is more judicial or in nature. There's what we call, and I'm getting technical, legal for you, but it's called the optional protocol to the same treaty on economic, social, and cultural rights. If a state has ratified the optional protocol, the individual cases that have happened in the country and that have exhausted all the legal remedies in the country, they can go to the UN system.
Okay. Elena, thank you very much. You're very kind to share your knowledge.
No, thank you.
And your candor.
Thank you.
Your
A
energy.
rigorous discussion.
Thank you. Well, if you come back, please pass by.
Thank you.
Vamos a corte y regresamos para seguir hablando del tema. Las ciudades se han convertido, muchas de ellas, en monstruos de la discriminación. ¿Cómo? ¿Dónde? Sobre todo, ¿de qué manera enfrentar este fenómeno? Volvemos con los especialistas, no se vaya. Volvemos a Espiral. Ahora tengo conmigo a don Enrique Ortiz Flores. Enrique, me da mucho gusto tenerle aquí. Él trabaja para Hábitat Internacional, la coalición de Hábitat Internacional. Y un poco la petición, Enrique, es, escuchamos a Leilana Fara hace un momento, su visión de relatora de la ONU, pero hay temas en los que no puedo entrar porque es México, concretamente, sí. Y usted los entiende bien. Deje comenzar con la primera, esto del derecho a la vivienda adecuada. está en la Constitución, está completamente el tema adecuado, porque es la diferencia, hay derecho a la vivienda en México, pero adecuada es una connotación. ¿Cómo lo ubicaría usted en nuestro contexto constitucional?
Sí, bueno, en la Constitución estaba puesto que toda persona tiene, no toda persona, toda familia tiene derecho a una vivienda digna y decorosa, que era una definición un poco vaga porque no es toda familia, sino toda persona, en primer lugar. En segundo lugar, digno y decoroso, no sé cuál es la diferencia, pero Naciones Unidas lo que propone es vivienda adecuada.
¿Cuál es la diferencia entre digno, decoroso y adecuado?
Adecuado quiere decir que es más complejo. O sea, no es solamente tener vivienda, sino que la vivienda haya seguridad de tenencia, que tenga acceso a servicios,
O sea,
equipamientos.
documentos que demuestren la propiedad o documentos que demuestren la renta.
No es solo la propiedad, sino
Certidumbre.
cualquier forma de tenencia que haya certidumbre. No habla de la propiedad individual solamente, sino de cualquier forma de tenencia tiene que ser, estar segura. Por eso en Naciones Unidas, por ejemplo, los desalojos los califica como desalojos forzados, como grave violación de derechos humanos. Ahí hay mucho sufrimiento humano. Otra, acceso a servicios, equipamientos. Otra es la accesibilidad, o sea, todos tienen derecho. Los derechos humanos son universales y eso hace una gran diferencia con la manera de atender la vivienda actualmente. Todos tienen derecho, independientemente de su ingreso, de sus preferencias, de su situación, es universal. Y además también accesibilidad a quienes tienen que usar la ciudad, por ejemplo, discapacitados, también esa parte de accesibilidad. Luego, la otra es la asequibilidad, que la gente la pueda pagar. Eso es muy importante. Siendo los derechos para todos, tiene que haber programas que permitan a todos, aún a los más pobres, acceder a la vivienda. El siguiente es la habitabilidad, que eso es lo que se maneja más, que sea suficiente el espacio, que la vivienda sea segura, que tenga iluminación, etc. La otra cuestión que es también importante, que incluye el derecho a la ciudad, es la ubicación adecuada. Y este es un punto clave, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, actualmente en México, con la elevación de los costos de la tierra, en la Ciudad de México, por ejemplo, la gente la estamos mandando a 40 kilómetros. Ese no es un lugar adecuado, y menos para los pobres. Su trabajo está muy lejos, entonces están haciendo 2 horas y media, 3 horas para ir al trabajo, otros tantos para regresar, más el trabajo es absolutamente inhumano. Y el último es la adecuación cultural, que es otra de las cosas profundamente olvidadas, ¿no?
Que el hábitat
se adecue a las prácticas culturales, a la forma de vivir, etc. Por ejemplo, ahorita en la reconstrucción, esto de que llegan con modelitos y casas llave en mano, ¿no? Que les van a dar, diseñadas en un departamento aquí en la Ciudad de México, ¿no? Sin ver cómo vive la gente, cómo vive. Cada comunidad tiene su manera de vivir, es una relación con el clima, con el lugar, con el paisaje, con su cultura, con su simbolismo, ¿no? Entonces, el concepto del derecho a la vivienda adecuada es un concepto integral.
Incluye el paisaje urbano.
Incluye el paisaje urbano, por supuesto.
Ahora, este horizonte, como casi todo horizonte que implica un derecho, merece canales de exigibilidad. Porque si no, pues es un lindo nicho donde conozco a la Virgen de Guadalupe solo para rezarle, pero más allá no hay utilidad, a menos que el milagro ocurra. ¿Cómo estamos en capacidad de exigirle y a quién que estos derechos sean parte de nuestra realidad?
Bueno, la exigibilidad fundamentalmente es al Estado. El Estado tiene que generar los instrumentos necesarios para hacer efectivo este derecho para todos. Entonces, la exigibilidad puede ser de alguien que no pudo obtener la vivienda adecuada en estas condiciones, o principalmente se utiliza mucho en las violaciones, cuando hay desalojos, cuando hay situaciones de este tipo. Pero hay una cuestión que es muy importante y que debía exigirse. O sea, si tenemos una perspectiva de derechos humanos, habría que exigir que el Estado genere los programas y los instrumentos adecuados para los distintos sectores sociales, no solo para cierto sector, ¿no? Que se atiende, digamos, una clase media, después se baja un poquito cuando ya se satura, pero no llega a los más pobres, ¿no? Entonces, una exigibilidad debía ser esa. Hay instrumentos internacionales porque le piden a cada gobierno que ha firmado los pactos internacionales de derechos humanos, sobre todo el Pacto de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, que reporten, son periodos de 5 años, aunque en el caso de México nos hemos tardado más, cómo está evolucionando, porque los derechos son progresivos, no se pueden cumplir de momento, ¿no? Entonces, tiene que haber esa progresividad.
Déjame le pongo un ejemplo muy puntual
Sí.
para que me ayude justamente a revisar ese asunto de la exigibilidad. Las enfermeras, es un oficio que se requiere pues casi en cada colonia.
Claro.
¿No? Hay un hospital, se requieren enfermeras, donde hay un adulto mayor, donde hay una escuela. Sueldo hoy, una enfermera, déjenme ponerlo promedio, andará entre 9 y 12 mil pesos. Supone que la renta no debe exceder a 1/3 del ingreso.
Exacto.
Pues vamos a hablar de unos 3 mil pesos de renta. Una enorme cantidad de delegaciones, ya lo hice de colonias en la ciudad, no tiene viviendas a 3 mil pesos. Entonces, ¿qué ocurre? Que las enfermeras tienen que irse a vivir a 2 horas de distancia. A ver, imagínense que yo soy una enfermera y vengo a consultarlo. ¿Cómo le exijo al gobierno que me ponga una vivienda cerca de a 3 mil pesos?
Sí, sí, eso es algo que se puede hacer, pero desgraciadamente estas exigibilidades son individuales y lleva un proceso difícil.
¿Pero cabe?
Sí,
¿Tiene,
cabe.
¿Tiene posibilidades? ¿Conoce algún caso exitoso?
Normalmente la defensa de los derechos en México se ha hecho por la vía política, más bien, la presión social, etcétera, cuando las gentes se juntan para tener una mejor entrada.
Es una exigibilidad azarosa.
Exigibilidad
digamos.
azarosa, pero básicamente es por el lado político. Pero por el lado legal creo que hay algo interesante porque esto hay que verlo también más colectivamente, ¿no? Y los cambios que hubo en la legislación mexicana en el 2011 abren la posibilidad ya de gestionar derechos colectivamente. Y eso da un paso muy importante, pero en este campo de la vivienda no ha habido más, funciona mucho más la parte política hasta ahora.
Ahora, la política muchas veces tiene que ver con intereses. ¿Quién financió la campaña del candidato, a jefe de gobierno, a jefe delegacional? Y esto hace que quienes tienen dinero, y mire, los desarrolladores tienen dinero, en todo el mundo. Los que construyen segundos pisos, carreteras, centros comerciales, que ya tenemos muchos, pero seguimos construyendo centros comerciales. Esos individuos lo que hacen es financiar campañas y por la vía política anular derechos. ¿Qué defensa tenemos frente a esa otra vía? ¿O qué defensa ha visto en otras ciudades y en otros países donde los intereses políticos vinculados a los desarrolladores no acaban aplastando los derechos de las personas?
Creo que aquí hay algo que nos lleva a contemplar otros derechos, incluso uno que no existe, que es, por ejemplo, el derecho al suelo. Principalmente ellos lo que buscan es la apropiación del suelo, ¿no? Fundamentalmente para poder desarrollar. Y eso es lo que ha generado las inversiones tan fuertes en megaproyectos en las ciudades, los centros comerciales, todo este tipo de desarrollos han encarecido el suelo profundamente en las ciudades.
Son muy pocas de condiciones, excepto tener dinero para comprar suelo. Pues
Sí.
lo demás nadie les pide nada.
No. Y precisamente en la Constitución de la Ciudad de México habíamos colocado esta cuestión. Yo estuve en el grupo redactor original y habíamos puesto esta cuestión que fue muy debatida de poder captar parte de la plusvalía que generan estas inversiones en favor de la ciudad, porque grandes edificios están generando problemas a la ciudad, más demanda de agua, más demanda de estacionamientos, de lugares, de todos los servicios.
Lo voy a tener un segundo
y sobre
aquí.
todo una cuestión.
La plusvalía es el valor que adquiere una propiedad una vez que se construyó, ¿no? Es decir, el suelo vale X, pero el suelo más 2 pisos es X más 2, y el suelo más 10 pisos es X más 10, y lo que va a implicar. Eso es la plusvalía.
Sí, y es también lo que en relación a lo que costó la inversión, la ganancia que tiene.
Esa es la ganancia, esa es la
ganancia,
plusvalía.
es la-
Entonces usted lo que quería era que se tratara de manera más inteligente esa ganancia,
Sí.
que se grabara, que se le cobrara impuestos a esa ganancia de una manera tal que beneficiara a la ciudad.
Exactamente.
¿Y qué pasó con esa propuesta?
Pues hubo una oposición y un escándalo público diciendo que se le iba a quitar las plusvalías que había ganado o los aumentos de precio que había ganado la pobre viejita que había invertido hace 30 años, ¿no? Manejaron ese tipo de cosas y no se trataba más bien de que estas grandes inversiones que generan una rentabilidad muy fuerte al inversionista, las compartiera con la ciudad, porque la ciudad le está costando esas grandes inversiones con servicios, etcétera. Y también muchas veces con desplazamiento de gente. O sea, hay desarrollos de estos enormes que han desplazado gente y que esa gente, de acuerdo a derechos humanos, debería ser restituida, sobre todo de un lugar cercano a donde vive. O sea, la gente genera su vida en cierta zona, no mandarla a 40 kilómetros.
Sí, este es mi barrio, aquí crecieron mis
barrio, aquí
papás,
crecí,
mis abuelos,
este es-
tengo derecho a vivir
Tiene
aquí.
derecho a vivir aquí. Y eso, incluso en algunas instrucciones que se han dado por el Comité de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, va en ese sentido, ¿no? De que si hay un desplazamiento de gente, se le tiene que restituir un lugar cercano donde vive. Y eso cuesta. Y eso, todo eso lo tendría que poner la ciudad. De hecho, en la redacción original que habíamos hecho, decir, captar esas plusvalías en favor de que los sectores de bajo ingreso puedan vivir en la ciudad. Lo primero que quitaron. Lo segundo es que querían que se invirtiera en los mismos lugares donde se generaron las plusvalías, que sería Polanco, etc. Porque ahí se están generando costos para la ciudad. Y al final no quedó ninguna de las dos cosas, ¿no? Se quitó por todo este escándalo que se hizo.
El otro acto omiso grave es el transporte, ¿no? Lo platicaba hace un momento con Fara, con la relatora, que no hay una política de transporte que atienda a los problemas de la comunidad. Y vuelvo otra vez, por eso también hacer 2 horas de un lugar a otro o incluso construir zonas habitacionales que no tienen transporte, solamente si uno tiene coche, pero son para poblaciones que no tienen acceso al coche.
Sí. No, lo que ha pasado mucho en estos, esta libertad que se dejó ha hecho que las ciudades se expandieran brutalmente en México. A raíz de estas políticas de una apertura, que el mercado iba a resolver el asunto, hubo un estudio que hizo la Sede Sol. Había un periodo de tiempo en que la población en México, en las ciudades, variaba entre 2 y 3 veces su tamaño, ¿no? En ese mismo periodo, las ciudades se expandieron, esas mismas ciudades, 11 veces en superficie. Entonces quiere decir que es especulación pura, que la estamos pagando todos. Y que además genera costos permanentes, porque hay que mantener el pavimento, hay que mantener eso. Uno va a provincia, a muchas ciudades, y están semivacíos los fraccionamientos, ¿no? Entonces, se generó, hay desarrollos a medio de la milpa y hay casitas por todos lados.
Uno los detecta porque ahí está el rotoplas encima, el tinaco.
Y eso genera problemas de derechos fuertes. O sea, en primer lugar, transporte de esa gente a la ciudad. Contaminación incrementada, más lento el tráfico, costos económicos que estamos pagando todos a la ciudad. Es un desastre. Ahora se les ocurre hacer ciudades compactas, pero vamos a hacer, y lo único que se ocurre es nuevamente hacer torres para los mismos desarrolladores, ¿no? Que pues, la gente de bajo ingreso
no tiene acceso.
No lo va a hacer.
Déjeme cerrar con una última pregunta. La administración de nuestras ciudades, déjenme poner el caso de Guadalajara, ¿no? Guadalajara se vuelve un municipio para ricos y la zona conurbana, municipios para pobres. No todos, Zapopan, por ejemplo, tiene zonas muy ricas, pero en realidad...
Pero también tiene zonas muy pobres.
Esa es la lógica. La verdad es que es la lógica de la Ciudad de México y los municipios del Estado de México. Y entonces esta distribución institucional lo que hace es que pues, los municipios conurbanos tienen una lógica desconectada del lugar donde está el trabajo, que es normalmente los municipios más antiguos. ¿Cómo resolver esta suerte como de lavado de manos que se dan las ciudades con respecto a esas zonas?
Bueno, yo creo
conurbanas?
que una de las cuestiones que necesitamos incluso para hacer efectiva esta realización del derecho a la vivienda para todos es tener una política de suelo. No tenemos una política de suelo en este país. El suelo se maneja, el suelo, igual que el agua, son bienes comunes que nos da la naturaleza. Y no solo son para el ser humano, son para la vida. Entonces, y las manejamos con una mercancía libre y sin control ninguno. Ahí hay una función fundamental del Estado de controlar esto para hacer efectivo ese derecho para todos. Los que más necesitan estar en la mancha urbana son la gente más pobre, porque su trabajo está en donde está la industria, donde está el trabajo. Están haciendo 2, 3 horas en esta ciudad, mucha de esta gente para transportarse a la ciudad, se desintegran las familias, es un desastre.
Violencia.
Es un desastre. Incluso hay un estudio que hizo Clara Yusinman en Incide Social sobre
Ciudad Juárez.
En Ciudad Juárez y en varias ciudades, del impacto que está teniendo estos asentamientos periféricos sin servicios, sin programas para los jóvenes. Los jóvenes salen de las mini casas, se juntan con sus amigos, se hacen banditas y muchas de ellas son cooptadas por el crimen organizado. Entonces, hablamos de la irregularidad, por ejemplo, y casi culpamos a los pobres de que son irregulares, de que invaden lugares. Bueno, en algún lugar tienen que poner a sus hijos.
Interesante su reflexión, porque en efecto empezamos hablando de vivienda adecuada y le agradecemos mucho a Leilana Fara que nos ofrezca ese análisis comparado, pero en cada país se encarna de distinta manera ese derecho.
Sí.
Y déjeme quedarme con su reflexión. Si no tenemos una política de suelos inteligente, equitativa, justa, hasta democratizante, me permitiría decir,
Sí, claro.
pues habrá ciudadanos de primera, de segunda, de tercera y hasta de quinta.
Sí.
Ese es el resultado final. Enrique, muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado esta noche en Espiral. Gracias a usted por habernos permitido entrar a su hogar. Nos vemos próxima semana aquí en Espiral, todos los miércoles 10 de la noche.